consultation event. It's great to see so many people online. We've got a truly stellar cast of people from all across the public sector, and I think that probably is a reflection of just the interest there is in this particular topic. So, I want to extend a special welcome to Chris Stewart and to Jeffrey Simpson from the Executive Office, who are going to take us through the draft programme for government consultation process and say a little bit about the framework. Former colleagues of mine, obviously, and I'll be wishing them very well during the afternoon. I'm not going to articulate at length the many political, economic and societal challenges facing us at the moment, as that would probably reduce the time available for Chris and Jeffrey to explain how we're actually going to deal with those. Instead, I think I'll move quickly over to Anne Dixon, who's going to explain how we're actually going to manage the 90 minutes ahead of us, because I know there's huge interest and we will want to allow as much time as possible for people to make points and ask questions. But before I hand over to Anne, I just want to offer our very warm congratulations to Michael Wardlow, the chair of the Chairs Forum, on his appointment as chair of the Transport Holding Company. We all wish you very well with that, Michael, and good luck in getting the buses and trains to run on time, and especially to get some people into them as well. So, as I say, good luck, Michael, and I'll hand over to Anne.
Thanks, David, and welcome everyone this afternoon. Delighted to see such a great turnout for today's session. I want to quickly just run through the format for today, and as David said, just make sure that we make the most of this time. So shortly we'll hear from Chris Stewart and his colleagues in TEO to give us an overview of where we are at the minute. Then before we open the floor in general, we'll get a few early reactions from the different parts of the public sector as they're represented here today. So we'll hear from a board chair in the person of Frank Bryan. We'll also hear from a local government chief executive, and that will be Alison McCulloch from Fermanagh and Omagh, and also the chief executive of one of the arm's length bodies. So Patricia Higgins from the Northern Ireland Social Care Council will give us her view on where we're at. After that, then we'll move into a structured discussion on the big issues. We'll want to look at three key issues. First of all, what do you like about this draft? Then what do you think we could or should improve in this draft? And then we look at the business processes that would help us to support a greater focus on outcomes. And my colleague Heather Moorhead will facilitate that discussion. And then we'll have final reflections. As David mentioned, we have about an hour and a half for the session. Throughout the session, please feel free to add any comments or questions or reflections on the chat box. We'll be monitoring that and we'll endeavour to get to all of the comments before we close. So with that, I will hand over to Chris Stewart from the Executive Office.
Thanks, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. It's very good, if a little daunting, to see so many familiar names and faces. If you'll bear with me for just 1 second while I work out how to share the screen. But I promise not to give you death by PowerPoint. There's just a few slides there which I'll draw upon. But before I start, could I add to David's congratulations for Michael Wardlow. Michael's someone I remember very fondly from my days in education. Somebody I very much enjoyed working with. Wish him every success in his new role, where I know he'll make a really strong and positive contribution, as he always does. But could I welcome the opportunity to engage with all of you today. I hope that you'll all see this as part of an ongoing conversation that I know that many of you are already having with Jeffrey and Joe and their colleagues in the team. TEO is absolutely committed to co-design, an open and participative form of working. And our view is if you can't do that in a place the size of Northern Ireland, then we couldn't do it anywhere. But of course, when we talk of co-design, we tend to think mainly of citizens and communities. And of course, that's very important. But we recognise that we mustn't overlook the formidable experience and expertise that exists across the public sector. And of course, who better to help us define the outcomes that we're striving for than the people who will secure their delivery in the years ahead. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to draw you into that process. And with that in mind, I just want to pretty briefly cover three things. Firstly, a bit of political context, setting out where we are now and how we got here. Secondly, a brief overview of what the new programme for government will look like, what we think it will look like. And thirdly, just some reflections on next steps going forward. So firstly, in terms of context, I don't think it'll surprise anybody if I say that NDNA, New Decade, New Approach, and COVID are the two things that have defined and continue to define the context for us. And they're both very, very challenging indeed. I was reminding David there just before we started that he and I worked on NDNA a couple of years ago, and we probably both still bear the scars. And there it is on the first slide in all its glory. It's a fairly unusual document. If I say it was put together in a hurry and it shows in places, I think you'll understand what I mean. I think there are no fewer than 3 timelines for the programme for government in it, and they're all wrong. But we'll give you the real timeline today. It's unique in my experience in many ways. Firstly, it's a virtual document. You won't find an official signed version anywhere. If you see one on eBay, it's a fake. And to the extent that it was agreed at all, it was agreed over the weekend on social media. And it's the only political agreement I'm aware of that's been signed off on Twitter. Nevertheless, it's here and it sets the context within which we work. And it's wide-ranging and ambitious. And we knew from the outset it was always going to take more than one Assembly mandate to deliver it. So it was clear from the outset that a pragmatic approach to prioritisation was going to be required. And the executive was just beginning to engage on that about a year ago, when of course along came the pandemic. And for us, just as for all of you, that completely disrupted everything that we were trying to do. So in fact, we had to withdraw entirely from work on the PFG at that point. Jeffrey and his team were diverted onto COVID work, legislation, policy and guidance, where they worked away for many months. And in fact, we only got back to what we regard as our day job round about last September, when the executive set us the task of having a PFG in place for 2021-22. And effectively that meant asking us to do about 12 months work in around about 6. Challenging, but not impossible. So where that led us, the next step towards a new PFG was a very extensive round of engagement in the autumn with a broad range of stakeholders, and that informed the development process. And one of the most recurrent themes, and certainly one of the most pleasing ones for us, was that there was universal and very strong support for the outcomes-based approach. And that's reflected in the draft outcomes framework, which is our first product, if you like, of that process. There it is in all its glory. And those are the suggested new outcomes in draft at this stage. Now, we deliberately present them in circular form, and that's to emphasize the interrelationships and to move away from any notion of a hierarchy of outcomes. They're all important. And building on the outcomes themselves, there's the framework. And that, I think, helps to illustrate the change in approach that we're looking for. Of course, the headline change is the reduction in outcomes from 12 to 9. And we think that's simpler and more logical, while still retaining the breadth of vision and scope that you'll all be familiar with in the previous 12 outcomes. Also, we think by moving away from a pattern that equated to 1 or 2 outcomes per department, we hope we can reinforce the concept of shared ownership and shared responsibility for delivery. And as I hope you can see there, we've also tried to make the language simpler and clearer. But that's just the start. In due course, I think you'll see more fundamental changes in our approach. The new PFG, when we finalise it, will be primarily web-based, and we'll have much less emphasis on physical documents from now on. It also won't be time-bounded. You won't see an end date in the programme for government. Instead, it'll have an ongoing existence, but we'll regularly refresh it and update it, and it'll evolve. We think at least annually, we'll have to look at it again. We're also going to reposition the indicators. They'll still be there, but our view, again, reflecting on feedback, is that in the past, there has tended from time to time to be far too much focus on the indicators and less on the outcomes. And indeed, some of the indicators tended to be regarded almost as targets or outcomes in their own right. And that isn't what we ever intended. So we're going to reduce their prominence a bit, but they will still be there. Alongside that, there'll be what I call the democratization of the data. So a lot of the data, indicator data will be online. It'll be much more accessible to stakeholders than it has been in the past, and it'll be capable of analysis by Section 75 groups. And all of that is with the aim of empowering stakeholders to feed back to us on what is working and what is not, and to shape the evolution of the PFG as we go ahead. You'll also see in due course much more focus on the key priorities and actions under the Programme for Government. Now that sometimes worries people when I say that, and they fear that I'm signalling a return to the past and the old widget counting or ribbon cutting approach that we've had to planning. So let me assure you that isn't the intention. Our focus remains very much on outcomes. But to borrow a phrase from Alistair Hamilton, the ropes need to touch the ground. We're aiming for outcomes, but we need to be able to demonstrate to people how it is that we intend to bring them about. And crucially, the PFG needs to be the tool by which consideration of long-term outcomes changes the decisions that we make now, particularly around our investment priorities. So in terms of next steps, well, we've still got quite a bit to do. The consultation on the draft framework and the accompanying equality impact assessment is ongoing. Got some weeks to run yet. And after that, I think we're likely to have what I might call some political fun. The executive will consider the draft outcomes framework and of course the outcome of consultation. Its initial consideration was much shorter and much more trouble-free than I thought it would be. So I think the real political fun still awaits us. And thinking back to the talks that led to NDNA and the range of positions that was taken then, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the final framework puts on a bit of weight and gains an extra outcome or two as we go forward. But time will tell. But our aim is that we'll have a final PFG in place by round about June, so a little bit later than we hoped, but certainly I think still a considerable achievement for Jeffrey and his team if we make that. In terms of how we will use that and what it will mean, well, the ideal situation, what we'd be aiming for, would be what I call the three-legged stool. A multi-year programme for government, a multi-year budget closely entwined with it, and a legislative programme to roll things forward. The reality is we're going to be quite a long way from that for a number of reasons. Firstly, as you all know, the budget is for 1 year only, and it's a very difficult one. But we need to keep the focus on outcomes, even if we find ourselves in a cuts exercise. We would argue strongly that the programmes that we should protect or invest in should be those that make the greatest contribution to the largest number of outcomes. Secondly, COVID has, as you all know probably far better than I do, stressed the entire public sector. And there will be limits, I think, for some time to come on our delivery capacity. And we have to bear that in mind. And it's likely then that the executive will focus first on the immediate recovery period as we move out of the pandemic. And after that, its priorities for the remainder of the Assembly mandate, the end of which is fast approaching. And thirdly, of course, this is Northern Ireland, so there's an election coming. So recognising the reality of all of that, we in TEO have one eye on the next mandate. And we want to start planning later this summer for that multi-year approach, which we hope will kick in earnest from April 22 and beyond. So in conclusion, it's a difficult time, perhaps the most difficult time of all, to bring forward a PFG, but it's no less important than we do so for that. The temptation, given the pressures that we all face, is to narrow and shorten our focus. And indeed, at times it may be very hard to see beyond the immediate challenge of trying to repair the economic and social damage caused by COVID. But if you'll forgive me for finishing with a cliche, if we do what we've always done, then we'll get what we've always got. If we want to get the right answer to the core OBA question, is anyone better off? Then we have to grasp the opportunity of the PFG for fundamental outcomes-driven change. To borrow someone else's phrase, building back better cannot mean building back the same. Thank you. I hope that brief skip over the ground will provoke a conversation. I look forward to hearing your views for the rest of the session. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was a very useful and frank insight as to where we are now. So if I could turn first of all to Alison McCulloch, the Chief Executive of Fermanagh and Omagh Council. Alison, just to get your perspective on how those messages land with local government, and maybe to get a little bit of insight from the experience in local government in relation to community planning, which is so closely aligned to the PFG approach.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne. And maybe firstly to say, I don't think I've ever been described as being part of a stellar cast before, so David certainly set everything up very well. So thank you. And thanks to Chris for the presentation. Maybe just a few general comments first, if I may, Anne, before community planning. Clearly, I think the stage we're at in the new programme for government is welcome. And I think it's difficult to disagree with the outcomes as presented. I think it's fair to say probably a little bit surprised at the absence of indicators at this stage, even in draft form, because I think, and going back maybe to the community planning experience, in general, what is measured tends to get done, and things maybe which are left unmeasured or unmeasurable become much more difficult, I think. I would welcome the comments and the commitments on the data sharing, and certainly the move towards the online and more accessible analysis of information. And also the commitment around co-design, which, as you indicated, Chris, was embedded in New Decade, New Approach. Now, I'm not sure if this part, today's session, is part of co-design, and maybe just to express a bit of disappointment, I think that engagement to date with local government has been limited. I certainly think that there is an opportunity around engaging formally with community planning partnerships. Maybe that is the intention. Certainly if it isn't, I would suggest that that opportunity would be pursued, because not only are the vast majority of the outcomes very closely aligned to what most of the community planning partnerships have, I think given the intention for this to obviously stretch beyond the current assembly and well into the next, it would be important that our reviews of community planning are reflective of the general direction on the programme for government. I think there are some inconsistencies in the language as presented at the moment, but that will probably be picked up, no doubt. And finally, I'm not sure if the opportunities of COVID have been fully enough explored. I think, as you'd maybe alluded to in your opening comments, Chris, one of the great benefits that we have had in working together, both from a local government, central government, and with arm's length bodies, all of the structures that were in place were able to mobilise extremely quickly. That's largely been because of community planning. And I think that we should probably reflect that recovery piece a little more fully. Having said that, we will certainly, from a sectoral point of view, be responding. I imagine each of the councils, each of the community planning partnerships will, but I would encourage that more active consultative piece with the partnerships, even over the next number of weeks.
Okay, thank you, Alison, and I'll let Chris and colleagues come back on those points in due course. If I could move over to Frank Bryan now for his initial reflections from the point of view of the chair of a board.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne. And for members, I'm chair of Belfast Metropolitan College. So Chris, very much welcome this engagement today and your open, honest approach. It's not often I hear a presentation where it refers to 3 timelines, all of which are wrong. So I welcome that transparency and the spirit it's offered, and I can sometimes associate myself with find myself in similar practical challenges. So I wish you well in all of that. Also particularly welcome your repeated message around sort of the shared ownership, because I think that will be central to how ultimately we deliver the outcomes. More general comments I would say from the start is that I certainly very much welcome the inclusive ambition that it sets out for Northern Ireland, and that overarching ambition stretching across the 9 priority areas. And I do like the circular graphic and sort of I think it encourages a platform for further engagement and conversation. I also note that within the document itself, it references under each of the priority areas a multitude of strategies. So I guess there's going to be a significant piece of work that will ultimately have to follow and work out, and ensure we don't have a case of the tail wagging the dog, and ultimately take our lead from the programme for government when it's ultimately sort of signed off. I guess other general comments is that I appreciate what the document's doing, but I do think that there's merit in any document of this substance being able to incorporate our core values, how we are going to choose to engage with each other as we get down to business, and that's core values between the obviously across government, to the arm's length bodies, to the community, and sort of council areas, and to the public. So I don't think you can overdo that enough in terms of setting out those values, which ultimately will shape and determine the culture through which we will commit ourselves to engaging and ultimately deliver. I think I'd like to see a bit more clarity or succinctness around our purpose in this programme for government in terms of what's driving this work, and it needs to clearly sit on top of all of this, so it's simple and in a language that the public can really sort of engage with. I note that when the document talks about how it's developed through engagement and co-design and outcome-based, if I piggyback on your three-legged stool, I'm going to sort of add in the third leg of that, which is co-delivery. Because again, I think co-design, outcomes-based and co-delivery are central elements. And just a wee side note on the outcomes-based, coming from the private sector, one sort of methodology which I see having great effect is OKRs, where you set objectives with key results. Now, they can sit alongside KPIs, the key indicators, but crucially, they have cycles of delivery, quarterly cycles sitting within annual cycles, sitting within the cycle of the overarching strategy. And I think there's something in that that potentially could add focus and keep things moving at pace, and ensuring that we're on track. So happy to pick that up as a side conversation. Welcome the commitment to long-term, multi-year. I think it's something which departments and arm's length bodies have been screaming out for some time. I guess the proof of the pudding will be when we see the budget settlements that sort of sit alongside that. It's absolutely critical that we see longer term budget settlements so we can properly invest as well as doing the delivery. The next comment I'd make was just in terms of the programme for government, very much welcome the proposal that it's a live format. It will be constantly under evaluation and be adjusted. Equally, would be a big fan on sort of publicly accessible dashboards that again makes it accessible. But I don't underestimate the implications here for being able to move with agility at pace. We need to really unpack our risk appetite, I think, in all of this, which hasn't really been given an airing yet, the implications for governance. And critical in all this, I'm going to sort of put my finger on leadership, an investment in leadership to affect this new way of doing business, creating change, and recognizing the challenge to changing culture within all our organizations, whether it be department, arm's length bodies, sort of councils and further afield. So I guess that's where, to my mind, the focus needs to be in terms of moving from aspiration to substance. And if we are focused on that substance, it will be around partnerships, collaboration. And for arm's length bodies who we like to look upon ourselves often as the trusted delivery organizations, I think needs to be recognized the potential that we have to deliver on behalf of a number of sponsoring departments. I know for the college, we obviously, our key sponsor is the economy, but equally well, we have a very constructive relationship with the Department of the Communities, because our dual mandate is about giving access into the world of work and skills and helping people get jobs. So I think we need to facilitate a lot more of that. And to do that, I do think we need to potentially fast track partnership agreements in a meaningful way, so that we are sitting very much alongside the leadership given from the departments. And my final sign off is very much around the need to invest in the leadership to actually deliver this change. So that would be my comments, Anne.
Thank you very much, Frank. That's a really useful perspective. If I could move on now to Patricia Higgins from the Northern Ireland Social Care Council for the perspective from a Chief Executive of an ALB. Have we still got Patricia online?
Sorry, I think I was muted there, was I? It would be better if people could hear me speaking. So I did thank you, and also thanked Chris for his presentation there earlier on. And what I said was, I think I'll probably just follow on a bit from what Frank has just been talking about in relation to partnership and leadership as well. And Chris, I was delighted to hear you talk about, underpinning Programme for Government is a willingness for co-design, openness and participative working, and also shared ownership for delivery across government departments, and also about empowering stakeholders. And there's a very clear statement in the foreword to Programme for Government and then in the introduction about working in partnership, and not just across central government, but with other sectors. And I think that's the real challenge in terms of, I think as Frank talked about, moving from an aspirational document into something substantive. If we're going to deliver a Programme for Government, and if we're going to deliver the outcomes for the citizens, then clearly across government and across the sector, the public sector, we need to work collaboratively together. And that can, as we all know, be a challenge in terms of how we make those partnerships work. And I think Frank actually made a really important point in terms of leadership and changing culture. So that, I think, for me is really welcome. And in the terms of the work that we do in the Social Care Council, partnership is a very prominent way in which we work. But it is challenging, and I think this will be challenging also for government. And I would be interested in the conversation that we have now about how do we do that? How do we make partnership, co-design and co-production meaningful in terms of delivering this Programme for Government? Thanks, Anne.
Thank you, Patricia. So before we move into the wider discussion, Chris, if you wouldn't mind, if you could pick up on a few of those points, and I think jotting down the key themes I'm seeing so far around engagement, partnerships and collaboration and leadership. So Chris, if you don't mind taking it from there.
Thanks, Anne, and indeed, and thanks to all three colleagues. I mean, already some very useful and constructive feedback, which we will think very, very carefully about. I'll not try and answer all the points, but as you say, I think a number of key ones there. Firstly, welcome the candid feedback from Alison. If we're not doing enough in terms of engagement with local government, then we'll take receipt of that message, and our commitment is we'll do more. We'll remedy that. A number of themes, I think, then coming through from all speakers, and I think a sense of purpose and strategies underpinning the PFG in particular were mentioned. Again, in the spirit of candor within these 150 walls, there are too many strategies listed there. That's the long list. We have to think about delivery capacity across public sector on this, and the executive is going to have to make some difficult decisions, not about not doing things, but about in the order in which they're done. And again, our mantra will be, well, which ones will make the greatest contribution to the most outcomes? And that's what we think the decision-making framework should be around. That emphasis on co-delivery and on leadership and on culture, I think, is incredibly important. Another piece of work that I'm involved in at the moment is the High Streets Task Force, on which, watch this space, you might see announcements over the next day or two. We've looked at the evidence and the good practice on High Streets task forces wherever they exist. And there's a very, very high degree of commonality, and it's all about those things. It's about local civic leadership and the building that capacity and putting it to good use. And that's a lesson that I think we need to learn in terms of co-delivery and real partnership with local government. That point about leadership and culture and how we'll do it, a recurring mantra of mine is that we shouldn't look for structural solutions to behavioural problems. I think much of that just requires us to behave differently. If we get used to working with each other, if we get used to being candid, then I think that will put us on the road to delivering the right results. There's an example that I frequently quote, a formative experience for me in working in that way. It's from quite a few years ago now, but when we first introduced the Commissioner for Children and Young People and the first children's strategy for Northern Ireland, the children's NGOs are very active in this space. They've been thinking about it for years before we had, and they wanted to be involved. And they asked for proper co-design and full involvement, not merely to be consulted, which we agreed to do on the basis that the development process would be confidential until the end, with no public comment until we'd finished the work. But at the end of the work, people were free to comment on any aspect of it that they wished. And colleagues in the NGOs respected that, worked very constructively with us. And I'll never forget what they said publicly at the end of the exercise, which was, we think you've got this about 80% right. We think the other 20% is wrong, but we know why you've done it that way, because we were involved. I take that every day, if we can get that in any piece of work that we're doing. So I think the test is, if our collective behaviours are such that whatever percentage of this you think we've got right or wrong, you know exactly why we've done it that way, not because you were consulted, but because you were involved.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. I'm now going to hand over to Heather Moorhead, who I know is battling with the digger outside her window. So I'll pick up if the noise gets too much, but Heather's going to lead us through the next section.
Very good. Yeah, you couldn't make it up. There's been a site next to my house for a while, and of course the digger has arrived just now. So it's really lovely to see everybody. I think we've got really three key questions that, rather than go through the individual questions that they've highlighted, because people will have a chance to respond online, Chris, or an email per organisation. But if I thought that we could just begin, if you do have any questions for Chris, if you'd raise your hand or even just come on camera and let us know. And then we want to just explore sort of three key things. What do you like about this programme for government? What is helpful? What do you think could be improved? Anne's already mentioned these. And then I think already you can see the big theme coming out is what behaviours and what business processes underpin those, and are the things that we can actually do to support that change in behaviour, because it won't just happen overnight with the state of the relationships that we've got and the ways of working that we've got that are so predominant. So what can we do to help ourselves? So we're going to begin with that. So if you do want to have a question, if there's something you want to just check with Chris on process or something, if you just let me know, pop up your hand or even just come on camera. So David Sterling, I see a wee question from you there. David, do you want to just ask that? And Michael, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, Chris, I suppose we keep coming back to this, but when we look at what the Scots have achieved with their national performance framework over the last probably 13 or 14 years, but a lot of their success is down to the fact that they always had a fairly cohesive political leadership, with a strong common purpose. We've got a 5-party coalition here where it's quite often difficult to get agreement on priorities and to get decisions taken on some tough issues. Do you think we can still deliver outcomes-based accounting in this structure? And if there are any doubts about that, I suppose the question is, to what extent can civil society, can the people here who are online today actually help to just mitigate some of the impacts of our rather complex political structure?
I think we've got challenges to overcome, David, in that regard. Now, some of them are structural in the fact that we have, unlike the Scots, a fairly rigid system of separate departments in which each permanent secretary is accountable to his or her minister and must operate under their control or direction. But I don't think we give up at that point. I think there are things that we can do. I think it would require a step change in the way the executive regards itself. Again, at the risk of delivering sort of career-ending candor, there are times when the executive behaves as if it's a forum in which it trades off competing policy proposals, as opposed to a single administration trying to set and chart a way ahead for the jurisdiction. And that, I think, is a product of our political past and of the system in which we find ourselves working in. But I think the outcomes-based approach might help us find a way out of that. If we can encourage the executive to look more at the linkages and the cross-fertilization of particular proposals. For example, you recall, David, one of the things that came up most frequently during the talks process that led to NDNA was childcare. Now, if you just look at childcare very narrowly, you'll conclude that, yes, better childcare would be a good thing and directly relates to the outcome on giving children and young people the best start in life. But if we actually look more broadly than that and see improving childcare as an economic measure, something that would allow us to deliver a step change in terms of the supply of skills that the economy is crying out for, then that might cause the executive to just look at that in a different light and see it, instead of being just a pet project of one minister or one party, as actually being something that could be central to the programme for government and relevant to quite a number of objectives. I'm not suggesting that that should be the sole focus of the executive, but I think if we could paint for the people of Northern Ireland more of a sense of the priorities of the administration for the mandate rather than the competing priorities of 5 parties, that would be a huge step towards a Scottish type model.
Brilliant, Chris, thanks. Michael, do you want to come in, and then Colin McKenna?
I have an observation and then a question. The observation is we're talking about a culture change, and culture in shorthand is how you do stuff. But culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. Culture comes from ethos. And I think we can try and change culture, but if we don't change the underlying ethos, that is our values, culture won't change. What will happen is there will be a set of rules and we'll behave in a particular way in particular circumstances, but that doesn't last. So my observation is we need to work as hard to change the ethos, and that's about how we work together. That's about the values and the principles, not when we get into the classroom or we get into the Zoom conversation, because we actually know how to behave there. The bigger issue is what drives us to do what we do. The question is, and this is where I'm a bit concerned, having been involved way back from before Share Future, I don't see any definition of what success looks like as a society. And there's a laziness generally in the use of the term diversity, because all that diversity does is deal with optics. It says, and diversity is used here a little bit interchangeably with inclusion, because we're talking about an inclusive society, which is not the same as a diverse society. So let me suggest what I think that means. Diversity is making sure, if you like, the forensics of the mixer there, that we have a recipe and we deal with it to make sure enough people who are disabled or Black or women or minority ethnic communities are at the table. But what diversity sometimes does is it delivers silos. It emphasizes difference. Inclusion is the next stage. It actually says, how do you put the recipe together to make a cake? So I would love the stretch target to go to inclusion, which is actually measured in the bottom line. And it's not about training or mentoring or Section 75. It's actually about what is the value of having all these people, the diversity? How does that actually deliver a better society? And so, for example, 3 times every day there is a race incident, and yet race, sectarianism still is the thing we're focusing on in here. Whereas race, in my view, is the same thing. It's we're afraid of difference. I would love a more courageous attempt to say, we are working towards an inclusive, not a diverse society, and that some of the targets should stretch us beyond simply the number count. So I'm not expecting that Chris, gives me an answer to that. Love to have the chat with him, but too many of us are too happy just to do the figures, because it's too hard to go beyond that to say, well, what do those figures deliver in terms of betterment for society at large?
Chris, do you want to come back?
I will, even though he gave me a get out of jail card there, I will respond to it. Passionately argued by Michael as ever, and I absolutely recognise the arguments that he's making. I suppose the easy answer that I could give is ultimately those would be questions for ministers and the executive, but they are valid points which I think we should put to them. An observation that I've made in the past, and this is when I was arguing for at least consideration to be given for an outcome around tackling paramilitarism, was that much of what has been in programmes for government in the past has been undoubtedly good, but if you covered up any of the locational references, there are things that you could see in the programme for government or a similar document in any Western liberal democracy. And to what extent have we actually picked out for the programme for government the things that are unique, either in nature or in scale or degree to Northern Ireland? I'm not saying that we're unique in terms of racism, but we have that as a set of issues here, just as we have everywhere else. We have issues around sectarianism that are unique in degree and to an extent nature here as well. And we absolutely have an issue around paramilitarism, the like of which doesn't exist in any other jurisdiction in the UK. So how are we addressing those things in the outcomes and in the programme for government? All of those are difficult areas, and I don't claim to have an easy answer to them, or to claim that it would be easy for the executive to adopt an answer to them. But if we want to move beyond a sort of good but nevertheless generic programme for government, I think those are the things that the executive would have to address.
So if folk, Anne and I will be recording some of the comments and feeding those back. So if you do, we won't get round all the questions, but if you do have other comments and things you want to raise, then do please pop them in the chat and we'll try and get to as many as possible, but at least we'll bring them in. I'm going to try and take a couple more questions and then I want to get into the actual structure so we can feedback a bit more formally. But Colin McKenna and Bonnie Ainley wanted to come in. If you could just try and keep it as tight as possible. I'm just keen, we've 80 people, so we're just trying to get us as many views and get people hearing different views as possible. Colin, if you gonna pop on your microphone?
Yeah, no, I think I'm on, Heather, thank you. And I take the instruction and the threat that has come from you to be concise. So I mean, it's slightly broader. It probably speaks a little bit to David's earlier point on how we get the word Scotland got to. And remember, Scotland, I remember having a conversation with George Thorley some years ago, who told me after 7 years that Scotland had made a good start. That was probably about 7 years ago. So I think if we don't actually have the vision to try to get there, it'll be difficult to get there. But my question, Chris, is probably around that broader societal engagement in all of this. So I'm looking specific. I could look at any of the outcomes. I'm looking specifically at the economy one, given my role in the Department for the Economy. And it's what have we done to engage with the broader society? So I see, as we go through the various bits of that particular outcome, responsibility for DFE, for DAERA, for DFI, etc. But what are we doing? And you did reference the High Street Task Force, and we may see something of that in the day or two. You're too late. Ministers Kearney and Middleton have something out this morning on that. So it's starting to come to life. But I'd be interested in what we're doing to engage with the private sector, or what have we done in producing it? Where has the engagement been with the private sector, with the community and voluntary sector, and where are health and all in the economy one? There's a big role, I believe, in terms of the health and wealth strategies in previous years. So I just like to see what have we done to engage with the other sectors outside of government, and I suppose I would include local government in that. And if not very much is the answer to that, which it may be, I think the High Street Task Force is a really good example where we are starting to engage, albeit after 6 months after launching the strategy that we're now starting to do it. But at least we're starting. So what have we done, and what can we do with the private sector, community and voluntary sector, local government, and all of that? Yeah.
Chris, can we just hang on and take another couple, and then you could maybe answer them together just to get a few more voices in. Bonnie, had you, thanks Colin, been very well behaved there. Bonnie, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Heather, and I'll endeavour to be equally as well behaved and just keep it very brief. Thank you, Chris, very interesting to hear what you had to say. I'm just struggling with the decision-making framework that will circle around all the outcomes being equal. I mean, I love the kind of King Arthur's table and the whole equality thing in relation to outcomes, but if we're going to base it entirely on investment opportunity against how many outcomes can you hit, I can see an enormous amount of political engineering going on around that. And surely, given the restrictions on our budget, we should be looking at effectiveness, and that may not necessarily be the number of outcomes you hit, but we need effective investment. I'd also love to see something really clear and transparent that shows what kind of savings stroke benefits would come from a 3 to 5 year budget plan, as opposed to this endless annual budget when we're setting this program against a number of electoral terms and a much longer ongoing vista. So surely it would be a helpful thing to see very, very clearly the benefits to all if we were allowed to have a bit more of a view in relation to a longer budget. So that was really my two things. Thanks, Heather.
So we're beginning even to get in already into some of those details. What do you like? What do you like less? So we'll get into that now. I had somebody, Bernie from DAERA, just wanted in, and then we'll move to more structure stuff. And I'll try and bring in as many people as making a comment as possible. Please do keep making a comment, and we'll feed through those and bring you in on those. Bernie.
Thanks very much, Heather. Chris, you mentioned the budget at the start, and I think last week we were involved in the budget consultation, and I think what strikes me is that the budget is very much focused on particular initiatives, particular allocations of money, not directly linked to the programme for government outcomes. People have talked about a cultural change. Do we need some kind of budgetary cultural change as well to be able to deliver this, so that we're actually putting money towards the outcomes as opposed to particular individual projects or individual budget lines?
Okay, Chris, do you want to try and address those, and then we'll open up to the next section?
I will. Your challenge of brevity might be slightly difficult in relation to those, because they're all good questions and good points. Firstly, on Colm, I know you'll appreciate a gentle pushback in the same spirit as the question was given. I wouldn't agree with you that what we've done is very little. Equally, I wouldn't claim that it's anything like enough. We've got more to do there. The current COVID context is challenging, but we need to invest more time and effort in the sort of engagement that you've rightly signalled as being important. So we absolutely recognise that we've got more to do there. On Bonnie's point, if I gave the impression that we would encourage or tolerate our colleagues making bids or advancing arguments simply on a numbers count of the number of outcomes that they would hit, then let me correct that. I entirely agree with you. That wouldn't be enough. It needs to be the contribution that they would make, the effectiveness of the intervention to the outcomes that should be measured. So it might be the case that a proposal that made a very limited impact across a great many outcomes would be outweighed by something which would make a very significant impact and a smaller number of outcomes. So we have to avoid the sort of blunt instrument. And this relates also, I think, to Bernie's point, and I think, Bernie, we're a long way from outcomes-based budgeting, but entirely agree with, I think, the thrust of the question, which was that we need a step change in the relationship between the budget and the budget process and the programme for government outcomes. And some of our colleagues understandably point to the difficulties in doing that and the pressures that they face, but it's not impossible. And again, to give an example of where I think we could begin to think differently, colleagues in economy are working on an energy strategy. Not surprisingly, that will look at decarbonisation of transport and traffic. Now, and if you look at data on air pollution, you can plot the air pollution contours for Northern Ireland fairly easily. And if you did that on a map which had no roads, you would nevertheless know where the roads are, because you can pick them out from the air pollution contours. Health colleagues could link that very easily with data on COPD and asthma and other respiratory diseases. So you could, using existing data with just a little bit of work, see the effect that an energy strategy, which involved decarbonisation of transport, would have on health outcomes. So it's getting our budget process, I think, to assess proposals, competitive proposals, in a different way, Absolutely not by simply allowing everybody to claim that everything they do is going to do something good for every single outcome, but actually digging into that and saying, what would the effectiveness of that investment or disinvestment, because we need to be prepared for disruptive change, what would the effect of that be across the outcomes that we're striving for? And I go back to what is perhaps simple, hopefully not simplistic example, the one I gave earlier. I think if we look at childcare just as childcare, you'd think it's a good and narrow thing. If you think of it as an economic lever, you start to think about it differently, and it might start to come out differently then in the competition for budget.
Okay.
Sorry, that was not at all brief, but
no, but
understand why.
You can see those things, and people already begin to get their heads around how did those things all begin to fit together, and how do you then begin to prioritize? I'm going to try and move into a wee bit more structure so that we can, try and draw out. So I'm kind of asking the question, although a couple of people have indicated that they want to speak, but really around what do you like and what could be improved. And I see a couple of people already making notes in the chat function there. Lorda from the Department of Health, did you want to come in?
Heather and colleagues, afternoon. Lovely to see you. First of all, can I apologize? I was late joining, so I missed the first 15 minutes. My apologies. Our in-trays and health are fairly full at the moment, as you can imagine. I just want to thank colleagues for the opportunity to hear about and to discuss planning for the PFG. I think it's incredibly important that we get a chance to reflect together. I've heard the word partnership almost in everybody's reflections, and I think that really is going to be the key to what we do going forward. My specific comment really related to the fact that I think it would be helpful for us to hear reflections on how the recovery and rebuilding that's going to be required as we come out of the current pandemic is going to influence the work on the PFG. Because obviously we are in very unique times. We are very mindful that all of the measures we have in place are going to have a very significant impact on all of our health and well-being. And in that context, I think the overall context for the PFG work is very different now to what it would have been 2 years ago. So it would be very helpful to get colleagues' thoughts and reflections on how PFG will change, how the planning will change, and how the delivery will change. Because I am mindful of comments made earlier that a lot of the PFG outcomes have health and well-being at their very core. And if we don't have a healthy society, we really aren't going to be able to deliver most of the PFG piece. So thanks, Heather.
Yeah, and it's sort of a way of thinking, isn't it? Because everything begins to relate and impact on everything else. So it's how do you measure that and how do you add value to each other? Chris, if you can just hang on there, I'm going to bring Bumper in. Bumper Graham. Bumper, I'm not doing a very good job. Could you introduce yourself just so folks, and Lord is from the Department of Health in the CMO's office. You Deputy
Thanks, Heather. Currently Chair of the Local Government Staff Commission. There's been a lot of discussion this last few minutes about the interface between the programme for government and the budget. I have to say, I'm more cynical about some of this. I think I'm writing off PFG for the next year because of just the timeline we're in, COVID and everything else, and the end of the mandate. But I do welcome what Chris said in his introductory comments about the need for a multi-year programme. But it's with great fear and trepidation then, and I suggest that that needs to be done in tandem with a spending review. And I bear more scars than most in my previous life as a trade union official of spending reviews. But we're in an entirely different position now. We do not know, as far as I can see, what the real loss is of European funding for many projects going forward. And my cynicism tells me not to back Boris in any significant backfilling for loss of European funds. And where we are now is we're having this discussion today on the PFG. There's a discussion on Friday about the budget. And I don't see how you can have a comprehensive cross-cutting PFG without having a comprehensive spending review beside it, and particularly given that where we are now in the immediate post-Brexit position and no assessment of loss of European funds.
Yeah. So, and are there things, Bumper, that you particularly like about the approach? I mean, are you supportive of that in general?
Yeah, the Staff Commission has been doing a lot of work on mental health and well-being, and we've had discussions on the draft mental health strategy. So I do see a need not for just getting your digger in to demolish the silos within government departments, but also between government departments, local government and NDPBs.
Absolutely, it's a big theme, and I think how do you practically do it becomes the issue. Chris, do you want to come back on a couple of those points?
Yes, thanks, Heather. I mean, absolutely agree with Bumper's point about the need for the multi-year approach to this. And one of the things that's featured in NDNA will feature in Programme for Government. It's already a reality on the landscape for colleagues. The need for transformation in health and social care and in education has been recognised for many years. Colleagues are working hard on it. That's incentivized, and the context has changed yet again by COVID. You simply can't do those things on the basis of one-year budgets. If you're talking about changing the workforce profile, it takes many years to train and educate the next cadre of professionals coming along. You can't change the pattern of education provision on a one-year basis. You need to be thinking about cohorts of children and their educational experience as they pass through. To really do what we need to do in terms of transformation, you're going to need a period of double running of the old system and the new system. Otherwise, those who are going through the system will suffer greatly while we're doing the transformation. So we simply won't secure the sorts of outcomes that we're asking for in the way that we want without that multi-year approach that allows us to plan. But looking back from that takes me back to Lourdes' question, which is, but what are we going to do right now as we emerge from COVID? Well, I think inevitably the executive will want to have a recovery strategy, which looks at what's immediately in front of us, and that will focus on not just an economic recovery, but I think a broader societal recovery as well, and the recovery of our public services. And I think we would all recognise the risk in that if our energy and our time is devoted to that very necessary shorter time planning, do we lose focus on the Programme for Government? Do we fall into the trap that Bumper fears, that we have to write it off for a year, perhaps longer? I hope not. I wouldn't be quite as fearful as that. But I think inevitably there will be some initial focus on the next period, the next few months, and then the period until the end of the mandate. That's why I did say earlier that in addition to what we're doing right now, we want to start the planning now for the multi-year period. None of us can be certain when the multi-year period will kick in, but the sooner the better. But we can't wait for that to happen. We need to do the planning for that now, because these things will take many years to achieve.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So I'm just going to try and invite some more comment on things that you like and things that you think could be improved. I mean, so there's a lot of things that we're not in control of, but there are some things that we are in control of. What is it that we should be saying to Chris and TEO colleagues that they can do to help us all use this methodology as a way of working? Jim, I see you've got your hand up there. Jim Livingstone.
Okay, I'll keep it very brief. I would appreciate if Chris could say a few words about indicators. To me, and I think metrics and how we measure success and progress are critical. And I was a little bit concerned that he seemed to imply that they were going to be given less prominence. I understand exactly why one might do that, but I think the mistake in the past has often been using indicators because they're handy, rather than investing in research and finding out, what are the real measures of success and progress. So I'd appreciate some comment on that, please, Chris. Thank you.
Happy to respond, Heather, or take more if you want.
No, go ahead. And I'm going to give them a bit of warning. I wouldn't mind Kieran coming in, Kieran Donnelly, the Controller and Auditor General, because I suspect that I hear people a lot of times say that it's some of the things that they feel his office are doing or saying that prevents them working in this more collective way. And I maybe thought that Brett Hannon from the Strategic Investment Board might give us some comments too, because there's a lot on the strategic investment agenda. So
I'll begin with a response to Jim.
I'll knock on Kieran's mic.
I'll also give a hospital pass if I made a couple of my colleagues, Jeffrey and Joanne, I think, are on the call, both of whom know more about what's going on in the indicators than I do. But I'll start. Jim's point is absolutely right, and yes, I do want to draw a distinction between giving less prominence to the indicators and taking away from their importance. Jim is absolutely right. We need evidence throughout this, and we need to use the evidence properly. I think our concern is that we haven't always used the evidence, the indicators in the right way in the past. And we've allowed the indicators actually to become their own targets. And the indicators are not perfect. They're improving all of the time. Colleagues might say a little bit more about this. We can and we will continue to improve the range of indicators that we have and how they can be used. But they're only ever a proxy. And if you use your proxy as a substitute for the outcome, then I think that takes us down the wrong route. So I agree with Jim. It's not that we're abandoning indicators. We need to use them differently and we need to use them better. We also need to actually technically improve the indicators that we have. And if you'll forgive me for doing it, either Jeffrey or Joanne might be able to add a bit of lighter shade to that.
Hello, everybody. Oh,
go ahead, Joanne. Joanne, you're the indicator expert.
So, hello everybody. Despite what it might say at the bottom of my screen, my name's actually Joanne, and I'm the PFG statistician. So actually, I'm all about the indicators, quite frankly. And when Chris suggests moving away from the indicators, I think really what we're talking about is refocusing on the outcomes, and that's just to confirm what Chris said. Actually, we've done a lot of work internally in not just looking at the indicators that were present for the current draft PFG, because we've undertaken a full technical review of all of those indicators. And when I say technical review, I mean literally looking at them from, are they measuring what they say they're measuring? Are they available when they need to be available? Is there something better with a bigger sample, for example, that we could be looking at as an alternative? Are they still relevant? So a whole range of issues come into effect. Not just a technical review of the indicators that we used, but also an international review of other indicators that are used internationally to look at well-being of other countries that are running outcomes-focused programs. So those indicators have all been reviewed. We've also developed some standardized approaches in terms of availability of those indicators at subpopulations so that they can be looked at in real time for Section 75 groups and by geography to better align with things like community planning. In addition, we've developed some standardized approaches to baseline. And so we all know what we're talking about whenever we say the start of the measurement. When did PFG start and what's our jumping off point? That's not the be all and end all. I would agree. There's been a lot of work done internally to bring those indicator proposals forward for the current draft outcomes that are out for consultation right now. That'll need to be reviewed again whenever we're taking on board all of the feedback from the consultation. Now, that's not to say we've got it entirely right. The indicators are proposals and they will all be technically robust. They do address some of the lessons from last time, which is, as Chris described, a lot of focus on indicators and not enough focus on what we're actually doing to achieve the outcomes. So we've tried to address that. We've tried to ensure that the indicators are measuring what they're supposed to measure and they're technically robust and that they're not open to further candid political gaming, you know, that they're really objective and it's very, very clear to everybody what's going on in them. We've still work to do, but there's a lot of work has taken place.
Yeah, and it's a developing science as well, isn't it, Joanne? We're not alone in trying to find collective ways to articulate, to bring people together and not just recording activities. If it was, everybody would do it already, and they're not. So it's interesting. Joe, did you want to come in and make a couple of comments at that stage? And I'm going to, Kieran, I promise I'm coming to you in a minute. Joe, do you want in there? No, you're all right. Okay, Kieran, do you want to just, I think, Kieran, this ongoing dialogue is something that we've been talking about for a few years, about really trying to understand the processes behind all of this that actually help us move in the direction of more collective action and understanding where we're duplicating and where we're doing lots of activities, but they're not adding to outcomes. Do you want to say a wee bit about some of your reflections and cultural reviews and some of the things you're thinking about that can help us go down this route?
Oh, there's so much to say. First of all, I agree with an awful lot that has been said so far. I want to touch on the measurement thing first. I'm with Chris and the NISRA backup team there on their sort of considered view on measurement. I think a lot has been learned from earlier forays into this. I'm hugely conscious of the importance of getting metrics right, and that doesn't mean going overboard on metrics. A small number of carefully chosen metrics, I think, is important. And we need to be extra careful then that we don't, someone said earlier, it was Alison, what measured gets done. That's true, up to a point, that we measure the right things. But if we measure the wrong things, or you can get unintended consequences and the wrong behaviors. So great care, I think, needs to be taken in the selection of metrics. And I would also emphasize the importance of qualitative measures, because a lot of this stuff, you can't condense everything down to numbers. So there's also stories. There's that whole thing about the tyranny of metrics. The very simple framework that some public bodies are doing, I think Chris touched on this, how much do we do, how well do we do it, is anybody better off? As simple as you can get, and to actually report against that. I think that's so important. Sitting listening to everything that's been said, I think the thing that really strikes me is the need for alignment. Like, it's obvious you need alignment with multi-year budgets and whatever, but we need alignment with lots of other things as well. I think Brian talked a lot there about values and culture. And just thinking aloud, I almost think there needs to be a complementary paper to the programme for government, really describing the philosophy of how all public bodies are going to actually work it through. That will likely cover the values, the culture, the enablers, the leadership, and how when there are tensions in between, you can't do everything, what sort of processes will be used to prioritize. Because the best will in the world, you know, this is highly aspirational. I agree with Bumper on this. It's just not possible to deliver everything here, even in a 3-year time horizon. So there'll have to be hard choices on priorities. There almost needs to be a complementary paper as to what are the processes that will be followed and criteria to prioritize within this, and actually bring the political side into that, bring the political side into the principles and values. So in other words, this paper is no good on its own. It needs a complementary paper with vision, values, leadership, culture, and how we're going to work together, and a set of principles. Something as well on budget alignment.
I think for me, the lesson that we did, I don't know, colleagues will be aware of the Innovation Lab about governance of ALBs. I think the power of that was that people tend to talk across each other. If you're an ALB, you don't understand the pressures in central government. And so just spending a lot of time in building the understanding, just exactly the story that Chris told at the outset, when you understand and you've been part of creating that. So if we could find ways of creating business processes that we co-create our values and we create space to share learning so that we build a sense of understanding.
But I really want to come in here. I think it was on one of Chris's points. We will all need to behave differently, but I think that needs to be documented and stated explicitly to actually make it happen, and then get everybody to sign up to that across the piece. It needs to be explicit. It can't just be an expectation that it will happen automatically.
Because people are nice.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kieran. Brett, I just was going to invite you in from the investment strategy, because a lot of the work that you're doing will drive some of this. Comment on that, but maybe even on some of the processes and how you know, just your wider views.
Yeah, well, the investment strategy is one of the library of strategies which Chris referred to earlier, and which is we're currently engaged in development in parallel with the PFG and slightly behind it, because quite rightly the PFG should be driving the investment strategy. And many of the same problems that or issues and challenges that he faces are common to developing the investment strategy. In particular, we're trying to look up to 30 years ahead in terms of investment, and to have a one-year budget makes that much more difficult. But the three words I would focus on, which have all been mentioned so far, are alignment, effectiveness, and prioritization. Clearly getting the investment strategy and those other documents aligned with the program for government is going to be absolutely vital, because any discontinuity between those is going to cause enormous difficulties down the line. Secondly, Bonnie mentioned a really important point, which is the effectiveness of investment, particularly in infrastructure, because not all infrastructure is created equal. The returns on different sorts of investments are very different, and in order to determine where the money goes, one has to have a really clear understanding of what one is buying and the return on that investment. And then finally, picking up on what Kieran said, prioritization. That we're absolutely clear that the demands on the capital budget are going to far outstrip the ability to meet those demands. So what comes first? Where do we put the money in order to get that effective return? And that prioritization is an intensely political area, where a purely rational approach is highly unlikely to the end point that we reach without very clear metrics, very clear criteria for determining where those investments are made, and they have to be determined in advance rather than on the hoof. So I think there's quite a lot of work in all these areas which is yet to be done, and a relatively short period of time in which to do it.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. That's really helpful. I wonder if we could sort of try and focus the conversation on, you know, it's very easy to criticise and to highlight all of the issues, but I mean, if we were in Chris's position or the Jeffrey's position, what are the things that we would like to see? I mean, we always say about the level of diversity, and there's a lot of energy and ideas, and this is a really big and mixed group. So I'm just sort of wondering, are there things that you would like to see that might help Chris, things that they could focus on or that would help deliver? Or even, again, a lot of our conversation is about the business processes. How do we find ways to spend together that are not 2 days out of the office? You know, are there things that we can do to try and build more collective understanding across our stakeholder group? Because again, as Chris says, it's not very big if we can't do it here. But I'm not, Chris, I'm never too sure that we do it well. We do seem, for such a small group of people, to manage to make as many silos as we can sometimes. So again, just maybe some comments on that. I see Bernie Stewart has got a comment there about a few overarching or priority strategies. That might be something. Bernie, do you want to come in, or just let me know if people have ideas of things that they think that could help us along?
I haven't really much to add to what I've written there. It's just really, I think it would be useful. Chris gave a few examples of things that are cross-cutting, like, for example, the childcare, but even to have a few things in the document to spell out for people how it links the 9 outcomes, because there are so many things. For example, anti-poverty strategy would cut across so many of them. Now, you're in danger then of having far too many things that would contribute, but maybe just some exemplars would be useful to illustrate to people how things are joined up, I think would be useful.
And I'd reflect on the community development work that we did years ago. Sometimes if you can get people working on one thing, it fixes lots of other problems. So say, for example, if you're doing dementia-friendly communities, as everybody comes together to do that, it fixes lots of other problems. You know, so those are ways. And do you want to come in just about the role of or David Sterling, on the role of the forum? Do you think there's things that you'll be doing to try and support this process? I'm going to pick on Anne if she's...
Who couldn't find her unmute button. I mean, absolutely. I think that the PFG needs to be at the core of our agenda in the forum, given that we're working right across the whole span of the public sector, with departments, with arm's length bodies and local government. So if we're not focused and tuned into how the programme for government is developed and is being delivered as it's rolled out, you know, we really need to make sure that we're there in terms of the relevance. Certainly, I think everything that we're attempting to do in terms of building the relationships, building effective partnerships, figuring out how we collaborate more effectively together is all part of the process in terms of delivering together in terms of what's in the programme for government. And creating these spaces is always really important. And we thought we couldn't do it when we couldn't get together in a room, but you know, we've proved otherwise, and maintaining the engagement and the communication will always be vital.
Better. Graham Wilkinson.
That's right. If I could just add, Heather, you know,
yep.
I think we in the forum need to just think, as Anna said there, how can we actually do more to support the process? Because if we think that this is something for the executive office to do, well, then we'll have got it wrong. You know, this is a responsibility that's going to fall to all of us. You know, and like several people have talked about the importance of cultural change, behavioural change. Every one of us can do things to actually set examples in terms of behaviour, the sort of behaviour that's going to be necessary, the sort of collaborative behaviour that's going to be necessary in the future. And I think Anne's right. We need to find ways in which the forum and the Chairs Forum can actually provide a space where people can actually talk about the difficulties of collaboration and resolve some of those so that we can actually work better together. And certainly I would welcome views from people as to how the forum can, you know, in fact, both forums can be a force for good in that regard.
Yeah. And I think, Chris, one of the things, we've got massive networks. You know, the networks tend to get friends with the other networks, so CO3 and NICFA and some of the other networks, we have really good access, so we can sort of generate a bit of energy. Graham Wilkinson, I'm going to bring you in. You're talking about working collaboratively, so we say it, but we don't do it. Have you any? Do you want to say where you are from, Graham, and maybe just?
Yeah, Graham Wilkinson, Director of Skills in the Department for the Economy, currently working on. And I suppose that's why I made the comment around working collaboratively. I think, you know, we have all these lots of strategies.
You're dipping in and out there.
But I suppose where it's really we struggled with it is around implementation. And actually, I think for Chris, the challenge is how do you organise this across departments, across the public sector, to work collaboratively right across, and we don't get into the spreadsheet mentality where it had become very, very processy, where you filled in your boxes and you sent it back to the centre. We have to create an ecosystem around the programme for government where we're all working to shared outcomes, and I think that's a big challenge about how we organise ourselves and making sure that our plans are very clear and consistent right across all of the delivery partners.
Yeah, and I know Alison has had to go, but I come from a local government background, and where the rubber meets the road often is in the community, where these things all come together. So I think really we really do need to make sure that we're working very closely with local government in the tent. Frank, did you just want to come back in there? We're just moving towards the end of our time, so I'm going to come back to Chris to do some reflections and then to finish off Michael Wardlow. But Frank, did you want to see? You've got a
No, I'm happy to let the comments stand.
Just about case studies. Okay, so really maybe time for one or two other comments and then we'll just move to a close. Eileen, do you want to come in? There was somebody, is it David Brown? Somebody had come back about the child-friendly document they thought was very helpful. Lost that now.
Yeah.
You want to come in?
Just simply to say that I spent 6 years working with youth justice and spent a lot of time in the Juvenile Justice Centre, and I couldn't help but think as we were talking about all of this, I kind of stood back from it. We're trying to create a better place for people to live in Northern Ireland and for Northern Ireland PLC to run more smoothly. And people like the young people in the Juvenile Justice Centre, young people in general, I think it's important, in fact, it's imperative that we bring them with us. They are the future that we're trying to secure. That was the thought that I had just.
Yeah, that's fine. And Eileen, did you just want to come in with your comment there?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I suppose what I got certainly from Kieran's input was around the shared purpose and values and visions, and we do need something like that. This document can't sit aloof that 80 of us talk about it and the rest of the population are not connected to it. So this is really, for me, it's a programme for us all who live here, and how this will improve and enhance our lives and prosperity, and it's how we all play a part in that. So we're not working in isolation. So when I look at the document, I see the pinning of government departments to each of the outcomes. Then we're back into that automatic silo approach, which I'd be keen that we try and move away from. So the multi-year budget argument, we really need to crack that, and I'm not sure whether it's within our gift or not. I know Andrew Dougal put the question up as who's responsible for it, but I think Chief Executives Forum and the Public Chairs Forum are great platforms here to do significant influencing work to change that, because we cannot transform, certainly I'm speaking from health, we cannot transform without the investment required.
No, that's absolutely right. Okay, so I think we've only got about 5 or 10 minutes left, so I'm going to just come back to Chris to just reflect on some of the things that you've heard and some of the things you want to be taking away. Maybe just remind people how to formally respond, and then I'm going to ask Michael to close our session.
Thanks, Heather. Just a couple of observations and then I hope a practical suggestion. A lot of themes coming through very consistently and very helpfully in the conversation: the importance of partnership, real partnership, leadership, co-delivery, as well as co-design, and about making the behavioural changes that are necessary to bring that about, but not relying on that happening by itself, but having an explicit declaration of the vision and the values that we all expect to subscribe to, reflected in our documentation. I think that's a very helpful steer. I think a lot of the contributors, particularly Bernie and Kieran and Brett towards the end there, made the point about alignment and choices, and a number of colleagues have made the point about the evidence base, about making it as good as we can make it, but recognizing that it's never going to be perfect. Kieran rightly made the point that it has to be qualitative as well as quantitative, because what we're dealing with here is a set of political choices at the end of the day. The budget and the PFG will never be left solely to the rational analysis of people like us. Elected representatives will make difficult political choices. Our job is to give them the best evidence base that we can to help them make the right choices, and to give them the best evidence of what we think will work, and then the best evidence of what we can say is working or is not working, to allow them to make the choices then going forward. I think we all have to recognise not often that civil servants perhaps declare sympathy for ministers and politicians, but none of us have to get re-elected. They do. We have to make sure that's done, I think, on an evidence basis. And finally, I think just observationally, I think we're not going to have success in this by trying to do a little bit of everything. We are going to have to do that prioritization piece. And I think we collectively have a job in trying to encourage the executive in making its political choices, to try and choose what is the most important thing that they want to do. Is the focus going to be on the economy? Is the focus going to be on anti-poverty? Those things are not mutually exclusive. Is it going to be childcare? Is it something else? But there are choices to be made, and we need to be able to explain to the citizenry what's the basis on which we made those choices. Finally, what I hope is a practical suggestion. We've talked about the need to do better in terms of our communication, our engagement, our behaviours, are working together. Sometimes better behaviour comes from better understanding and better familiarity. I also came from local government a long time ago. If I went back there now, I'd be a stranger. It's changed out of all proportion from the local government that I worked in. I think we need more exchange. We need more secondment. We need more interchange. And that'll build, I think, a better understanding of the challenges that we each face in our sectors and organisations. And I think that would be a really solid, practical step helping us work much better together. I think we do a lot less of that than they do in Whitehall, Cardiff, Edinburgh and Dublin. And I think that's a deficit we could make up. Sorry, that was not brief at all. I'll shut up.
So Chris, can I ask you a wee question just before you leave? Why do you think that doesn't happen? It seems to me that we every 2 years we do an event or we do a report or we do this, and then we don't do what we said we were all going to do, like share more. What is it that is preventing us do that? You know, realistically, what can we do to challenge ourselves? Because those embedded behaviours just seem so intractable.
Well, it's not because we're all wicked people.
No, sure.
I think it's because we're all under stress and under difficulty. But I don't think that completely excuses it. I think there are things that we can do. Let's not, on foot of this, promise to put the world to rights and then come back in 2 years and explain why we haven't done any of it. But perhaps, and this is where the forum could guide us, I've offered one suggestion. It might be the right one, it might not. Let's pick 2 or 3 things that we think we could do as a network of networks to try and make this better. And then let's measure whether we've done it or not. And then let's ask, is anybody better off as a result?
Okay. Well, I think last time Dan and I knocking on your door, there's a few wee things that, you know, because we've been talking about some of these ideas, we'll be trying to bring them forward. I'm really sorry from my part. If you've wanted in and I haven't got to you, but hopefully you can put your comment in the chat and you've had a good chance. Because people can respond just on the internet through by email if they want a more detailed response, or just to your programme questions, and to just share that with the staff. As Eileen has said, this is a programme for government for us all. It's not just about the technical service delivery people. So I'm just going to call on Michael Wardlow to just close the session for us.
Just to thank colleagues, thank Chris and Anne and Heather to help us facilitate this. The point that you made towards the end is, you know, why this doesn't change. It's, for me, it's the fundamental difference of when we believe in something, it happens. And the problem is we believe in different things and we're focusing on too broad. And I think Chris's idea, let's focus on a couple of things that we believe will move this society on, that will make a real change. Because that's ethos, it's not culture, and that's what I think we need to do. I'm going to tell you very quickly, I'm not going to comment things that I have noted. They are generally, we're very supportive. We all agree it's going to be very challenging. We need to ensure that there's co-working, partnership, co-design, sharing, engagement, but all of that's nonsense unless it's meaningful. We need to ensure we identify leadership as we go ahead, and there needs to be this cultural shift that's driven by values. And we need to be examining our risk appetite, because there's no use taking things on if we don't have the risk appetite for it. We need to have metrics that are actually sharp and in plain English and that are joined up and shared across the piece. We need an alignment. There's no use having hobby projects or vanity projects popping up, because we can all argue for them, but we need to be clear that we sign up to this together. And this needs to be across the agencies and departments. And I loved what Kieran said, very simple. How much did we do? How well did we do it? And as a result, have people's lives been made better? Now, you can dress that up on all the metrics you want, but ultimately, what this is about is helping people have their potentials fulfilled. That's at one level. But actually, we want people to invest here. And that's why we need to be courageous in addressing some of those enduring fault lines that Chris talked about, like sectarianism and racism, and why we don't make difference. I guess what I'm offering from our Chairs Forum is, 140 public bodies. A lot of us deliver, a lot of us support, a lot of us monitor, and all those other things. And, we're better than the sum total of our parts. And it's important that whatever we do it together. And Chris, you've got it 80% right. And we know why the 20% you haven't done it yet. So thanks very much for your endurance and all the energy and enthusiasm. Thanks for everybody, those who spoke and those who didn't. And this is the continuing part of a process. So make sure that you get your responses in. And, if people want to share within either of the 2 forums, please feel free to do that. So thanks and stay safe.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully see you soon. Okay. Cheers.